Welcome to Module 14. Module 14 represents a slight fork in the road, if you will. Up to now, we've focused very squarely on the mechanics of getting the basics into your mind about how to write policy models, how to work with other users, how to organize life on your hub. This chapter, for the purposes of learning, deals with a very specific subject that at an early stage in your project you may not wish to bother with, but it's important that you know that these exist because sooner or later you're going to need them. And they're the command line tools. They are, as their name suggests, ways that you can get certain things done both on the modeling side and on the hub side using a command line. Put it simply, no user interface. So no nice graphical interface, just a command line that you enter to get something done. This will appeal to future administrators. This will appeal to anyone who's involved in automating certain things. The demo necessarily tells you all the interesting stuff about how to use these tools and when to use them. But we're going to focus in the presentation at least on the existence of these tools and why you might need them in the future. There are actually two different sets of tools, maybe even three if I was to go fine-grained, is what are they for? So we'll look at the purpose of each of them, and then we'll give you a very brief idea of how to use them. Even though some of them are for the modeling tool and some of them are for the hub, they all have a great deal of things in common. There are some restrictions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, let's stick with three basic types. There are tools to help you migrate. There are tools to help you administer things on the client side. By client side, be careful, what I mean here is wherever you've installed policy modeling. And then we have server side, by which I mean the hub. Okay, so there are tools to do with migration, tools to do with administration, and then there's server side stuff as well. Let's break them down into a little more detail. Probably the one that you won't reach for a certain degree, a certain amount of time, unless you are already migrating from an earlier version, is this: a tool to help you migrate projects. Well, what does that actually mean? It means that if you're coming, for example, from version 10.4.7 and you have upgraded your infrastructure and now you're looking at the hub in version 20A, you'll need to use this tool to help you migrate the files from the old version to the new. And we'll see a demonstration in just a moment. Be aware that with this kind of migration, there's probably going to be a fairly high impact in terms of rework that might be needed due to the large differences between the two versions. And we'll see about that in just a moment. So let's take a brief example of how this might affect you first of all. I'm going to go to my desktop. And let's see here. So in this environment, I have installed Oracle Policy Modeling 20A, as you can see from my command window. And over here, I have a project which I've placed in a temp folder because this is actually a version 10 project. And I'm going to use OPM migrate to migrate this version 10 project to version 12.2.18. So the first thing you might want to do is simply get into the habit of typing OPM migrator and pressing enter, because this allows us to see the help screen and see what information we need to provide to make this work. You can see, for example, it says you need to provide the project path and a target folder where the new project that will contain the migrated items will be stored. There's a variety of other options relating to if you want to change the project name as it's being migrated, or how numbers are migrated from older versions when working in Excel. I'm going to clear my command line again, and I will type in OPM migrator. I'll type in the path to the current version 10 project, temp demo development /pnc .xprj, and I want the upgraded project to land in the temp2 folder. And observe what happens when I press return. We see a confirmation that it's going to start migrating, and we see already some warnings regarding custom property values for a XSLT file, entities, children created, entities created, various screens have been migrated, some user-defined information that is no longer built in the same way in version 12 has been ignored, and it's migrated the files, and it's created a new project in C temp do B and C. So let's go and have a look at that now. And if I open it, you will observe that it now opens in version 20A. And although I've recovered some of the screens and the entity model, for a real-life scenario, I would, of course, need to go back through all of those warnings and messages that I received and make sure that I made any edits that were needed. It's important that you don't confuse the command line tool that we just looked at with the inbuilt version 12 migration utility. If I was to go here, I have several versions installed on this PC. If I was to open up in an old version, let's say I'm going to create a project in version 19C, so 12.2. something, as opposed to version 10 migration. There we go. I'm sure you probably have seen this already when you've opened up projects yourself, but if your desktop has several versions of OPM installed, when I go to the Hub tab, I'll be able to see here that, in fact, OPM is offering me directly the ability to migrate this project, which I created in 19C, to 19D, 20A, or 20B. 2.19 is 20B. So it's registering the fact that I have other versions installed and offering me the chance to make that upgrade between versions of 12 straight away here in the client. I don't need to use the migrator tool, which is dedicated to version 10 to 12 upgrades. If I click on this right now, it will upgrade the file and it will open the project again in the correct version. So this simple utility does not use the OPM migrator command line tool that we've been looking at elsewhere in this project. It simply allows me to move from one version 12 to another version 12. So one final scenario that I want to share with you, which I appreciate will make 3 different scenarios now. This involves working with a version 10 project, and instead of launching OPM migrator, choosing to simply go to the project file. I have one in front of me right now, and double-clicking it. When you know that you have both version 10 and a version 12 installed on the same computer. In that situation, you will see this message. There are 2 things that are important about this message. First of all, you can answer no, in which case the project will open in version 10. Or you can answer yes, in which case the migration tool will be launched, but it will be launched in a graphical format, not in a command line format. So if I click no, version 10 will load and the project will run as normal. If I return and I choose this time to say yes, we will see the relevant version of 12 will start to run. So I'm going to 20B. I want you to notice that although the project is about to be opened in version 20B, there is an extra option here. You may recognize this as being the option that was present in the command line in respect of rewriting Excel number formats, which change between 10 and 12. I'm going to say no to that. Just go ahead, because this is a very simple project. And now what's happening behind the scenes is actually the OPM migrator is running, and the messages you can see are corresponding to the stages of the OPM migrator. So the only difference here is you're running it in kind of a pseudo-graphical mode, and when you click the display the log, it will actually show you the migration log. My apologies, this is in French because this computer's in French, but you can probably guess that this is exactly the same process as the command line, only using this kind of graphical window as a front end. And now I can open the project in version 20B and carry on working as normal and repair any issues that may have occurred. So to summarize, there are really 3 scenarios. Scenario number 1 is where you're migrating using the command line from version 10 to version 12, and that's the subject of the command line called OPM migrator.
Number 2 is working where you're migrating from 10 to 12, as I've just demonstrated, but you're not using directly the command line. You're using a graphical prompt, but behind the scenes, OPM Migrator is running. And the third example is when you're simply moving from one version 12 to another version 12, and you're doing that through this little drop down that we showed you a minute ago. I can't go any further up because I've only got 20B as my latest installation. So that's the third scenario. I hope that all those have been clear.
Say okay. In fact, you can go right the way back to 10.4.7 and still use this notion of migration tool, the command line, to upgrade a project. But it's, in that case, it's going to be simple to use, but it doesn't give you any idea of the impact of the changes. If you're going to do this for real on a project that is in version 10.4.7, you can expect to receive a large volume of warnings, and you can expect to receive a large volume of output telling you that, well, we tried to migrate this, but we weren't able to because, or we did migrate this, but we had to change it. So there's a lot of caveats when it comes to migrating from older versions. And in the demonstration, we'll do a migration from a very old project, and you'll see the kind of warnings that we would get. Moving on to the other client-side admin tools, as you can see, there's a basic principle here. They all start with OPM, and they all do something useful. New project, build, export, launcher, run test. Of these 5, only 4 really are going to be of interest to you, as we'll see in a moment. All of them, frankly, are much more useful when you build them into an existing framework. So if you use Jenkins or you use PowerShell or you use some other scripting language, it makes sense that you'll want to use these to automate part of your migration process, your testing process, whatever. But just running them as a command line is useful and fun, but they tend to be much more powerful when they're integrated into a bigger picture. This is especially the case for build, export, and run tests, because as their name suggests, they build the project, they export it to a zip, or they run test cases. As we'll see in a later chapter, Oracle Policy Modeling allows us to build lots of use cases and regression tests to test that our rules actually work. Moving aside from the client, there's one other kind of command line that you'll also see in the demo, but this is a unique command line tool in that it is for private cloud customers only. Okay? So this only applies to people who have installed Oracle WebLogic and Oracle Intelligent Advisor in their own private cloud. They have access to the databases, they have access to the operating system. This is not for people who are in public cloud. Notice the difference. It's not a batch file, so it's typically going to be a command file or a shell file if you're not running under Windows. It's a tool that is provided for you. You don't have to create it. You will find it in the install pack. And it allows you to tweak some of the back-end functionality that only makes sense to do if you are a private cloud customer. So what can you do with it? Well, to be honest, there's about 50 different things you can do with it. I'm going to focus on probably the second one or the third one here. Is suppose you've installed your Intelligent Advisor and you are looking at your WebLogic and you're running the hub, and people are complaining that when they try and upload their project, they're getting a message telling them that the file is too big, or they're running an interview and the interview says, please upload a file, and they're putting a big file in, they're getting a timeout. Well, that's because there's a parameter on the server that changes the maximum interview file attachment size. So this is specific to interviews. So when you try and attach your photo of your driver's license to your interview, it fails if the file is too big. So you can adjust that value. You can also adjust other values. There are dozens of them. For example, you have a problem with your connection web service and there's a timeout on screen when you try and connect. It could be that you need to change that setting. So all of those settings are adjusted using this command line tool. So we've got a demo coming up, so you'll see both the client side and the server side stuff. But what do I want you to remember before we go into the demo? One, there are essentially different categories. Most of them work on the laptop or the desktop where you've installed product policy modeling, and they all have a prefix of OPM, so they're really easy to see. You have ones to help you build a project, which is like creating the zip ready for deployment. You have ones to export the zip, which, as its name suggests, creates an exported version of the project. You have ones that run tests, so executes any test cases that you've built. And you have other ones for migrating. The OPM launcher that I mentioned right at the beginning, you don't typically tend to use it. It's actually used by the OPM shortcut. When you double-click in your Windows Start menu to start OPM, you'll notice that it runs the launcher. So it's used to launch the correct version of OPM. That's about it. Here comes the demo. So in this part of the demonstration, we're going to experiment with two command line tools. The first one will enable us to run test cases, and the second one will enable us to create a deployment snapshot. Let's talk about the first of those two scenarios. You may remember a moment ago I updated my project so that it can now be opened in version 12. This project contains a Excel test case file. If you've already seen the chapter about test cases, then that's wonderful. If you haven't, this is simply a way for Oracle Policy Modeling to allow a policy author to create test cases, which are numbered, to provide inputs, and to test whether the outputs are what we're expecting. So it's a great tool for performing unit tests, regression tests, or functional tests where you are given scenarios and you need to implement them in a simple way for testing purposes. You can imagine that in a typical test file there are not 2 cases, there are maybe 1,000 cases, 5,000 cases, and you would need to run those scripts on a regular basis, of course as part of your regression testing, or just as part of your planned testing schedule. So run tests will run any and all test case files relating to a project and will provide us with some output. So I'm going to go to the command line. I'm going to clear this off for now. And we'll go and look at OPM run tests. Here's a typical command line for OPM run tests. I'll move that into the center of the screen and I'll zoom in so you can see it. So it has OPM run tests, ctemp2 pnc.xprj, so the direct path to the project file, minus HTML. There are several different file formats. For the most obvious one for this demo is HTML, but you can also have JUnit and XML. And following that is the name of the HTML file that I'm going to create. Let's create a different file name. So output demo.html. When I press return, any and all Excel test cases will be run and a report will be printed on screen and in the HTML file. Two cases passed, 0 failed, total 2, created a report in ctemp2. So let's go and have a look at that folder and let's go and have a look at the file. There it is, test output demo. Let's open it with a browser. And we have a simple output telling us which cases failed, which cases passed, and so on. So this is a great way of automating getting information about your test cases. The second scenario we're going to look at, recall something that we've already seen in the hub. You may remember that when you go into the hub and you look at deployments, you're looking at, if you like, end user ready project. This project has been deployed for the end users in one or more channels. This one has been deployed as an interview, this one has been deployed as a web service, this one as a chat, this one as a mobile application project, and so forth. You may also recall that in order to push a project into the deployment section, you need to click the Deploy Snapshot button in Oracle Policy Modeling. When you click the Policy Modeling Deploy Snapshot button, as you've probably already experimented with, the project will go to the deployment section of your hub, assuming you've logged into a hub. But what you probably don't know at the beginning is that when you click this button, before it lands over here, there is actually an intermediate step. The intermediate step is essentially building a deployment-ready version of the project. And that's why we call it a snapshot, because it's not the same as pushing something into the repository. So let's go and take a look here, and I'll open up the project folder just as a quick way to get to it. You'll notice that I'm in the PNC folder and that there's an output folder. this output folder, this is used by the deploy snapshot button. So when I click deploy snapshot, a version of the zip file is placed here representing a deployment ready version of my project, and then it is pushed into the hub. The OPM build option is a way of automating the creation of this zip file. And you might be thinking, well, why would I want to create it manually? Because when I click deploy snapshot, it happens automatically and I'm fine with that. Well, there are situations where it becomes quite useful. For example, when you need to give a deployment-ready zip file to a colleague who is going to use, for example, the REST API to deploy that snapshot into another hub. Remember that when you deploy snapshot, you deploy into the hub that you're connected to. And maybe you have multiple hubs and you want to take this project and deploy it into another hub. So one way to do that would be to create the zip file and then give the zip file to your colleague. So let's take a look at the command line. You'll see OPM build followed by the project file. And I want you just to take a brief look at the date and time of this file. It's dated 14/16. So when I press go, and it says I've completed the build, you should have noticed that the date and time changed. So I've now got a completely up-to-date version which I can give to my colleague and they can use, for example, with the REST API. Notice the size of the zip file. Compare that, for example, to the size of the zip file that you might see if you choose to click the share a copy of this project button. If I go to the desktop and I click share a copy of this project, you'll notice that it's 49K. That's because the version that you create when you click this button is not a deployment-ready version. It's a version useful for other developers. So that's a good piece of information for you to know, is the difference between the project version that you work with as a developer, as a rule author, and the project zip that you get when you click the deploy snapshot button or when you go through the OPM build option. So the final parts of our demo today are based around one more tool for Oracle Policy Modeling and then some server-side stuff. This tool is called OPM Export, which allows me to export data model information from a particular project. As you can see, I've entered the project name, but I also need to provide one of these options: all attributes, mapped attributes, named attributes, entity choices. Basically, I can filter what is exported in the export. I must also provide a file name for a CSV file that will contain the result. For those of you who are familiar with Oracle Policy Modeling, you might recognize this feature because it's also available in the user interface, and I'll show you it in a moment. So I'm going to create my output file, my export CSV, and to make it simple, I'll export everything. Usually this results in multiple files, each of which will contain my file name as a prefix. So now that that's done, let's go and have a look in my folder and see what I've got. Yep, I've got several files. Let's open the biggest one. And we can see that it's a well-organized output of my data model. As I said before, this is also available in the user interface through the export button, which you can see here. And the filtering options just above are exactly the filter options that were in the command line. So you can do it either way. I personally prefer the command line. The final demonstration for today is for private cloud only, so I need database connectivity information because I'm going to use admin.sh to perform an update of a system property. Notice there's prop name and prop val in this example, so I'm going to set a property name with a property value. Observe the other settings, which include database connectivity like username and password. I've added two values to this property, and when I go into my administration hub and go to the access settings, I can see the two values that I added in my command line. So this accelerates administrative features. That's it for now. See you next time. So let's finish off with the last two command line tools. In reality, there's only one, but for completeness sake. So let's begin by looking at OPM New Project. OPM New Project allows you to automate creating new projects. You provide a path, a specific language, a specific region, a time zone, and then the project will be created in that folder with the same name as the folder actually.
Probably the most interesting one when you're first using it is the list code option, which allows you to get a list of all of the available languages, regions, and time zones. That makes a very long list, so what you might want to do is you might want to pipe it into something like a temp folder. Let's call this list.txt. So then we could go to our temp folder and take a look at this. List.txt. And in here we would be able to view all of the different language codes available to us. And let's say, okay, we're going to use, let's use Spanish, ES minus ES. And the region we'll use is ESDO for Spanish in Dominican Republic. So you might run it like this. Let's put it in a folder called temp2. And project temp2 has been successfully created with the language in Spanish, the region Dominican Republic, and the default time zone. So you can imagine that in certain circumstances this can make it a little less error prone when people are creating new projects. The final command line, which you may have come across, doesn't really require much to be said about it because it's never actually used manually as a command line. It's designed to launch the most modern version of OPM that you have installed on this computer. It's also responsible for triggering various messages when you try and open a version 10 in a version 12, or when there's an upgrade that needs to be done. If you just run it from the command line, nothing happens, and what I mean is in the command line nothing happens, and the most recent version of Oracle Policy Modeling on your computer opens up as normal. So if you ever come across OPM Launcher, you'll know that its job is simply to launch OPM. That means we've taken the time to show you all of the different command lines available for Oracle Policy Modeling on your computer. Speak to you in the next chapter.